These are at least 3 of the NHS managers that initially refused to take any further action when consultant Dr. Stephen Breary raised the concerns about Lucy Letby in October 2015, including Alison Kelly, who's now been suspended, Karen Rees in the middle, and Ian Harvey. Now, I'll come back to Alison Kelly in a moment. Although she was then a nursing manager, she went on to be the director of nursing somewhere else, but has now been suspended. Now, in this video, I want to give you my frank views on situations like this, not necessarily specifically talking about the NHS or specifically about this scenario here, but what I've found in general in my many years of business experience and in some years of practicing as a lawyer. In organizations, large organizations like this, and in companies, small and large, I've found different sets of circumstances that have demonstrated nepotism, i.e. favoring family members, friends, colleagues and associates over other people, covering up mistakes, trying to rectify those mistakes behind closed doors so that nobody sees it, even within schools, trying to cover up when things have happened. I've seen each of those situations because they're trying to manage the reputational damage. But in some cases, as demonstrated by this Lucy Letby case, when managers try to manage reputational damage as against the complaints that are being raised, instead of focusing on those complaints and make life difficult for those who have raised those complaints, as we heard from Dr. Breary in the BBC interview I talked about on my previous video over on Black Belt Barrister. I'll link that video in the description below. We see that these people have their lives made more difficult, and that in turn makes it more difficult for them to raise future concerns or even deal with the concerns that they've got at hand. And I think that is absolutely and utterly wrong. If a concern is raised, it should be addressed seriously, whether that's in the police services, whether it's in the NHS, or in a privately held company, or even a publicly traded company. Each of these concerns raised with either a direct manager or their manager, or straight up to one of the directors, these concerns should all be taken seriously. They should be investigated properly, and the people raising those complaints should not be targeted and should not have their lives made more difficult for doing so. And yet that seems to be the case. One thing that I think has contributed to this situation here in this Letby case is that these nursing managers are not regulated in the same way as nurses and doctors. Now, many people will look at the 3 of these here. I don't know much, to be quite honest, at this stage about Karen Rees or Ian Harvey, but I have pulled up a page about Alison Kelly because she has currently been suspended from her current position, which was the Director of Nursing at the Rochdale Care Organisation over here on the Northern Care Alliance. Now, many people will wrongly, I say many, some people may wrongly make the assumption that she doesn't have the qualifications as a nurse and so on because she's not regulated as a manager in the same way that nurses are. But looking at her bio here, she has a very impressive bio. Over 30 years of experience as a nurse, initially qualifying in 1988, before moving on, then undertaking clinical or surgery intensive care, corporate leadership roles, and so on. And so ultimately, the culmination of her experience, bringing her to this position here, where she also speaks at leadership conferences. She's an honorary lecturer, quite clearly, highly experienced, well qualified, and professional in everything she did as a nurse. So why then is the question, I don't have an answer, why then is it the case that these concerns were raised, but as Stephen Breary put it, not taken seriously? And I, for one, feel that that is because managers in this position are not regulated in the same way as nurses and doctors are. But I respectfully suggest that anybody working in an organisation such as the NHS, making managerial decisions which can quite literally lead on to have life and death consequences, depending on what those decisions are, ought to be regulated in exactly the same way that the nurses and doctors actually providing the medical care on the front line. And this leads nicely into the question as to what is this inquiry going to reveal? Well, it is not a statutory inquiry, so it is not going to have the power to call upon evidence or to call witnesses, and ultimately it's going to have very limited powers in what it can do. So I have to admit to being fairly cynical at the outset. This is my personal view based on everything that I've read as to this inquiry actually being suitable, given the gravity of what's happened, given the importance of how these decisions are made, who is responsible, who is accountable, and what changes need to be implemented, because that ultimately is what an inquiry such as this is supposed to do. It is supposed to find out what happened, why it happened, who was accountable for it, who was responsible for it, what decisions were made or not made, delayed for what reason, whether they should have been delayed, whether they should have been made sooner, and how, more importantly, do we avoid that in the future. And in my view, a statutory inquiry will be able to call sufficient evidence and witnesses to come to those determinations. And otherwise, it may just end up a very simplistic explanation which doesn't really lead to any solid conclusions or reassurance for those moving forward. Now, I mentioned in a previous video, and I did a few tweets on it some time back, that I have been in a hospital setting where I have been forced to ask questions. I have been forced to, insist that I stick around because I had concerns, and I was right to have those concerns, and the ultimate consultant that dealt with us later said that I was right to raise those concerns, I was right to raise those questions, and ultimately may have saved a life. So I would urge you not to be disrespectful, and certainly not to insult and be rude to anybody, but certainly feel that you can ask questions if you are in a hospital setting or any other kind of setting. Even if it's in a legal setting, if you've got a question for your lawyer, just ask the question. Lawyers such as myself are not going to be upset about you asking a question. What will be difficult is if you don't ask that question and then later on you don't understand what happened, then it may ultimately be more expensive or more difficult to put those things right later if you didn't understand them in the first place. And when we're talking about medical settings, such as we are here with this Lucy Letby case, it is very much life and death, sickness and health. So do ask those questions. Don't be rude and don't insult anybody, but do ask those questions if you're in those settings and you need these answers and you need somebody accountable for that. So as I said, I think managers should be accountable, they should be regulated, and ultimately this should be a statutory inquiry, which ultimately should result in exactly that, enforcing regulation of those who are making managerial decisions in organizations such as this. Those are my personal views. That's what you're here for on Black Belt Secrets. Those are my personal views. I can explain legal concepts to you over on Black Belt Barrister. I can link those over on here on Black Belt Secrets to give you what I really think based on my experience and my profession. So with that, please do remember to like this video and subscribe. We are desperately close to 100,000 subscribers, so please do subscribe. I do enjoy sharing my personal views with you, particularly in cases where I feel everybody has a view and I think these views do need to be shared, and so these problems can be avoided in the future. So with that, I thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.